Everybody, thanks for joining us for another great scholar interview with the Civil War Doc. Today, we are joined by Dr. Holly Pinheiro, who is a assistant professor of African American history at Furman University. And his new book, The Family Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, will be out June 16th. I believe
15th, if everything continues to go perfectly.
By the University of Georgia Press, but you can go on, by the time you view this, you can go on and pre-order it. So I am going to ask Holly to tell you a little bit about his book, and we'll go from there. So, yeah.
All right. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone, Civil War Doc, for this opportunity. It's always great to talk to fellow scholars and friends. And yeah, so also just a quick note for audience members, and thank you, is to get it through the press rather than Amazon, unless you have some kind of like gift card. And I say that because you can usually, they offer sometimes discounts, so just keep an eye out for that. But yes, it will be out June 15th. Hopefully, I look forward to what everyone thinks on it. So let's see, the project, the very short version. So it is looking at 185 Black soldiers who served in either the 3rd, the 6th, or the 8th United States Colored Infantry that were born in Philadelphia and served in one of those 3 Black USCT Pennsylvania regiments. But it's not just about those soldiers. It's really about the soldiers and their entire lives and their families, including extended kin and fictive kin. So it looks at nearly 1,000 individuals, Black and white, from 1850 into the 1930s, to really, it's weird to say it like this, but to look at these soldiers as human beings, rather than also just limiting them to their time in service or as veterans, but to look at them in totality. And I say this because I am the child of someone who served for 25 years, that being my mother. So, sorry, for me, it's really important to recognize she's first and foremost my mom. Right. And that's how I will see her. And then everything else after that. And I basically took that perspective that I had to understanding the important experiences of these people. And even though this is about Black Philadelphians, they actually travel the world. Right. They are making, one of the soldiers is actually going to be the first, as a veteran, will be the first Black man to pass a state bar in the state of Florida and practice law. They will travel across the United States. One of them becomes known as the Black veteran barber, and he's literally traveling the rail lines and constantly promoting his service as ways to demonstrate his connections to the United States military and to this pivotal moment, but also for employment. And it's, to me, it's hopefully a thought-provoking story to understanding that the war was never just limited to those in uniform, and it was never just limited to that Civil War or Reconstruction era, that Northern Black people, at least in the case that I'm talking about, were born into a race war that they never asked to be a part of, and that they were constantly fighting, and I'm putting quotes around legitimacy, being defined by even sometimes Black elites, but also the United States government and other institutions that are trying to impose upon these peoples and these families what is considered the standards of appropriateness. And I'll totally spoil the end of my book. Hopefully you still buy it. As the book actually closes with a daughter writing to Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. I had no expectations to ever find this record, but it was in the pensions. And the short version is that this daughter of a deceased veteran is writing the First Lady during the height of the Great Depression. And I'm paraphrasing, but she says something to the effect of, "My mother is dying of cancer. I have cancer. My mother has unfortunately been rejected for a widow's pension, and we just want to know why. In the grand scheme of things, I recognize that I don't matter. But you and your husband, President, have done so much, not just for people, but specifically for Black people. Can you look into this case?" Eleanor responds in 7 days. I say this as a joke, but I really mean this. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And the fact that Eleanor, the First Lady, during this moment starts a correspondence with this daughter is also a way to understand the politics of memory. And what I'm arguing is the family's cause, because Eleanor, for example, is refusing to acknowledge the lost cause myth that ignored Black military service and the experiences of Black people in general. The First Lady does acknowledge and will fight on behalf of this family. you have to read to see how it ends, but it's just trying to extend our understanding, connecting it to great scholars like Nina Silber, who had the book, I believe, This War Ain't Over, for example, that there's a long history and understanding how war and what it means to be a person of color. Like, we need to understand the families to really get at these people in a more inclusive way.
Wow. Yeah. Now I'm definitely hooked, and I might like go straight to the back when I get the
I'll be
book.
honest,
Yeah.
that was the hardest thing I've ever written. And I say that because I never anticipated, doing stuff on the Great Depression, but it was the daughter's story was so powerful, and it really shook me. And the book, I'm totally spoiling it. The book opens with a widow in 1884, and she is basically tired of the United States Pension Bureau for the invasiveness and wanting to understand why she never got a legal marriage and whether their son was legitimate. And she says, and during this interrogation that went on for years, that the United States Army stole my husband, and we've been destroyed, and we have nothing to show for it. So congratulations, you won a war, but our family has never been the same. And it's just like these stories, these experiences, that's a better word, forced me to reconsider how I thought about the Civil War. These Black families were in a war for survival. These are families that were not enslaved, some of them the first generation to be freeborn. And we need to understand, what does it mean to be someone who was never enslaved, to see that there was a diversity of the Black experience in the United States of America.
So coming into this, one of my first questions for you was, how did, and you already touched on it, how did your mother's military service inspire you to write this? But now it's like, do you see like any of your own experience as a military kid in some of the stories here?
I would say, yeah, no, that's a great question. Part of it too is my obsession with the film Glory. I just got to throw it out there. Like, and it's funny, like I hadn't watched Glory in like 10 years. And then after I'd finished the book and I rewatched the film, I realized how much that film still influences the conversations that I'm trying to bring up, because Glory, and it's a great film, don't get me wrong, I use it all the time, but there should have been other films, and that Black women, for example, are only in like one scene, and Black women were always visible in those spaces. So I think I love Glory, and it does influence my scholarship because it's just, everyone knows that film. But yeah, my mother, she served for 25 years, retired after Desert Storm. And as a child, I love my mom, but as a kid, I was really angry at my mother because I viewed her service and her constant deployment overseas when I would get relocated with a different family member as though she doesn't love me, as though she's prioritizing the United States and their objectives over our relationship. So for a long time, I was very angry, particularly at when people would talk about, thank you for your service, and these ideas of patriotism and not sacrifice. And I'm sitting here going, why doesn't anyone care about her family? Yeah. And that's something that's always stuck with me. And I feel like, I mean, as I was researching and writing this book, I would call my mom all the time because some of the people's stories hit home to me, to see very different contexts, to see how they were struggling to keep their families together in the face of constant forms of discrimination, and how they constantly uplifted each other through all that, and how their communities were part of their stories. I think I remember when I completed the book, I called my mom and just said, thank you. Like, I was like, I think I understand your service better now. And I hope that, I think about this a lot, that I have been talking about this project and my mother is known to people now, right? Because that's like, that's not something I anticipated, but it's like, I say this to students. Sometimes like your personal experiences can shape your scholarship and how you see things. So what I'm arguing in this book is just that, like, we need to talk about families. And if we talk about families, we actually can be more inclusive, and the important role that women, particularly Black women, played in supporting Black soldiers and the Black communities. So in many ways, it's like the soldiers become the starting point to really get at, to me, the bigger point. Let's talk about what it means for a family. Who are the ones that are left in the wake? Who are the ones that are left to be the nurses, the ones that are fighting for their relatives to not be forgotten, the ones who are the, as Hillary Green, as astutely pointed out, they are the living monuments, right? And so it's like that has been very transformative. And when I've had the privilege of doing presentations, particularly in military communities, I've had a Vietnam vet cry, which makes me cry because I'm emotional. So you start crying, then I'll cry. And I had a student who was served in Iraq, and they say the same things like, you get it. You understand how we are fighting for things even after we've served, in terms of the bureaucracy with the VA now, right? In terms of these rights and things that we're owed. And what does it say that you're showing that Black people have been fighting for these things 100+ years ago, and we're still dealing with it? Yeah. And to me, that's a big point, is like, to me, it says a lot, but that military communities, they understand. I'm trying to provide a way for people to understand it's not just about those in uniform or who serve. It's about the people around them. They matter too. And their stories are just as important as those in uniform.
So did the families, the families of these soldiers, were they able to form their own community? Did they have a network of support for each other? Did they lean on each other? And I'm thinking about kind of, modern depictions of the military.
Right.
And, they're this community.
Right.
Like
That's a
Army
great
Wives.
question.
That was the show.
Yeah.
There's this community.
I know exactly what you're talking
about. Were there Black Civil War Army wives?
I mean, yes. That's a great question. So the first part is yes. So I lean on Brandy Clay Brimmer, Brimmer, for those in the audience. She wrote Claiming Union Widowhood. It's a great book. She and James G. Mendez, who wrote A Great Sacrifice. Those are two books I lean on a lot and encourage audience members to read. Brandy Clay Brimmer's book, she highlights exactly what you're talking about. She calls it the Grassroots Pension Network. And basically how in North Carolina for her study is that Black women connected to veterans basically were creating these support networks to try to their best to navigate the bureaucratic, highly racialized and misogynist and ableist pension system. For my family, and it's funny when I say my families, it's like I've been studying them for 10 years. So it's like they're with me everywhere, I feel like. There is some communities, without question. I do see a number of instances where soldiers are testifying in other people's cases and basically saying, say this, don't talk to them, provide this information. I think the larger Black Philadelphian community is doing their best to support each other. The problem's not theirs. The problem becomes, though, the invasiveness of discrimination, the bureaucracy of the Pension Bureau, the eventual erasure of Black military service and its meanings. All of these things together are working, attempting to negate their experiences. Having said that, the bigger point of the book is it's that Black families, communities never bowed down to those pressures, that they constantly fought, and that they use the pensions as ways to demand to be seen and heard, even in a rejection. And that the communities are part of that, right? That they're providing information that is necessary to do it. They're providing testimony sometimes for each other. They're providing housing. And the other thing is, at least for the veterans, some of them become the support network in terms of they're going and visiting each other. Like one of them will say, this fellow veteran, he comes and visits me every week, and he's the only person I remain in contact with. So it's like they understand that even if larger society is working to oppress and arguably forget them, they will never forget each other. And there's a beauty in that perseverance, to me, that is like, it's their ability to continue to fight in the face of all these ways in which they're trying to be minimized or just outright silenced.
Wow. So my next question is about Philadelphia.
Yes.
Why was there, obviously a very historical city.
Yes.
How does this fit into the larger narrative of Philadelphia history, but also
That's a
why
good question.
Philadelphia? Was there a high number of Union soldiers and families? Were they there? Were they in Philadelphia during the war? Did they move there after the war?
Those are great questions. So as I joke with students, this was an extension of my dissertation. The honest version when I did the dissertation was I had family members in Philly, so it was easier for me to afford to do the research there. So those trying to do research sometimes use what is available to you, and whether that's family or friends or whatever. So that's how it started. But over the course of the project, as you point out, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in general is a rich history, and particularly relating to Civil War era and antebellum, that just made Philadelphia to me very appealing. And I'm gonna keep it real. It was easier to study freeborn Black people in a city with a rich abolitionist women's rights history, but also an anti-abolitionist violence. Like there was already a lot of great foundations. Scholars like Du Bois have written about it with the Philadelphia. So it was like the jump off to do it was like, there's been a lot of work already done in Philly.
Yeah.
But what I'm hoping to show is like, there's a lot more we can say about Black Philadelphia and Black people in the North, because and I say this with the caveat of having family members who were enslaved in South Carolina and Florida. There has been a hyper focus on the enslaved experience to understand Black people in the United States. And there has been doing so, we have not focused as much on the free Black experience outside of Glory, even though a lot of them weren't even from Massachusetts or even free. So it's like, what does it say to turn our attention to places like the Midwest with Kelly Meserec's work for their own cause, and Philadelphia, and saying Philadelphia had the Christian Recorder, which was one of the most prominent Black newspapers at the time, which makes it great because Black soldiers were writing about their experiences in that newspaper. They had some of the most well-known abolitionist networks, including Lucretia Mott, Octavia, like a who's who. It's one of the key routes for the Underground Railroad. There was the Camp William Penn will be organized right outside of Philly. So it just made it, to me, it was like perfect because I wanted to look at a group of Philadelphians who lived in Philadelphia before the war and long after, who were seeing all of these different events, who are well aware of what's happening and how they are constantly having to fight to be included in these very important national, local, and state conversations. But Philadelphia is the people I study, I never will argue are representative of any other's experience. But I think they provide a way for us to push what does it mean to look at freeborn Black people who are fighting against various forms of discrimination, which include the mark of being a Black person, which therefore means you have some connections to enslaved people, right? But it's like the project looks at a lot of the who's who, Charlotte Fortin, the Purvises, Douglas, but I shift it away from them and say, we spend so much time talking about Douglas, Anna Dickinson. We need to talk more about Lucretia Mott, but that's another conversation. But it's like, what does it mean if we look at the actual people who are affected by military service? Who are the ones, mourning those who pass, the ones who unfortunately are going to deal with what we know as PTSD, because that's something I didn't anticipate. Domestic violence, sadly, will manifest itself in a number of ways with the soldiers who bring that trauma to their family. So sometimes the family civil war is a war amongst each other.
Yeah. I just, and hearing you talk about that, it made me think of Lisa Levinstein's book, A Movement Without Marches, that I'm going to have to read your book and then go back to her book and see the continuity and, in the Black experience of Philadelphians, hers during, the early Jim Crow period. And,
right. Yeah. I mean, the other thing, it's like, Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro is a phenomenal book. Problematic if you've read it in a while, because he says some things that are like, ooh, but that's a great book. And Joe Trotter Jr., that's the thing that I'm trying to do, is put myself in conversation and say, there's actually a lot of rich history going back to some of that most eminent scholars who have looked at Philadelphia as a northern urban metropolitan city with all these different caveats. There are a number of Civil War scholars who talk about the Civil War era, but for whatever reason, they're often not put in conversation. And if we talk about things like unemployment, if we talk about housing issues, if we talk about rent, education, all these different aspects, it's like, I'm just trying to piece together and say, Civil War scholars need to do more in acknowledging social historians who look at Theodore Hirschberg and others who have been publishing since the 1970s or 1890s, and also connecting it to Black Civil War soldiers who become historians, who are in their dedication saying the most important people are the families, especially Black women. So it's like a lot of this stuff has been written for a long time. And that's why I always say, like, I don't think what I'm doing is that groundbreaking, other than saying, can we talk about a family to understand the consequences of war?
Yeah. One of our other scholar interviews that's coming out this summer is with Anya Jabor, who wrote Topsy Turvy, about the children's experiences of war in the South. How does your book, you know, talking in concert with each other, I guess I mean, what was the experience of children of these families?
Any particular time, or just like during the war?
I guess during the war, yeah. Okay. I mean, you know, the one of the things that Anya argues is that, you know, the war was in the backyards of children in the South, but it was also, you know, you have also the children, the families that you're talking about had their fathers ripped away from them.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a really good question, actually. So I would also say Crystal Webster has a book that's about New York City Black children. I think it's called, hopefully I don't get this wrong, Beyond Childhood, I think. Crystal Webster. It's a great book. And I'm also thinking of James Martin, who's done a number of studies on Northern children, though he usually looks at Northern white children. The thing I'll say with, if we're talking 1861 to 65, or 60 even, is that the families that I'm looking at, one of the things that's fascinating to me, I mean, there's a lot, but is one, their decisions to go, it's like it was once the United States finally goes toward Black enlistment. Because the one thing is, like, for me, is like a lot of Black Philadelphians that are of age to enlist don't, right, of those three regiments. And that, excuse me, I'm arguing that it's a conscious decision, sometimes influenced by their families, because some of the soldiers were actually making pretty good money as civilians. One of them was an engineer, for example. And there is at least a few instances of family members begging the enlistees to not go, because they knew if you go, you're not coming back. So there's at least one of the soldiers, he writes on his enlistment papers, like, I'm gonna die, so keep this is your only proof. So it's like the families they're coming to terms with that. But also it's never just the fathers, it's sometimes it's the children, or if it's fictive kin, you know, they may be someone's like the only male in the household. So it's like bachelors, and that's one thing I really wanted to tease out in the book too, is like bachelors are sometimes one of the primary or the co-breadwinners in their households, and fathers are impacted by the war, but also single men still, and just like single women, have responsibilities to their families. And it becomes real when we talk about tearing up their pay, right? Like that actually impacts on conversations about manhood, but it impacts the families. Education, I've seen a few instances of particularly school-age children who will collectively leave and enlist together. But if we go before the war, so 1850 up prior, or up to the war, a number of them were not able to get a traditional formal education, or those that did were not able to stay in school on a regular basis because of systemic racism that was basically making it to where children, sometimes then as 5 years old, had to work. And some of the veterans are talking about that is the one thing they're the most upset about when they're 80, that they couldn't go to school on a regular basis. So one of them is Francis Hawkins, and he's living with his grandmother, and she's in her 80s in 1850. And he said, I was 7 years old and I was in school and I liked school a lot, but I had to go find a job because basically we never made enough money to survive. So he was talking about that as an old man, that like, this is the thing about his childhood that made him so upset, right? Is that he's not able to have access to education on a regular basis, not because they don't want to go, but because of racism that is impacting even children. Children, or I would argue, people are well aware of the conversations about the war, especially in Philly. There's no way you can escape it. Everyone's talking about it. It's in the newspapers. It's in church meetings. It's like it's being discussed. The problem, I would say, with war is enlistment. It undoubtedly impacts, access to education. It undoubtedly impacts these people's lives for generations, and some of them don't receive the formal education, which is unfortunate. But I do see in the post-war that a number of their children or extended kin do get access to education. So over time, it seems like there's more opportunities for that next generation of school-age students. But actually, I'll just close with this. A number of the Black girls in the families do get access to education, which I thought was actually awesome. Like I don't want to say it's equal, but it's pretty close, which says a lot about in terms of understanding that, Black girls deserve an education, though they were not receiving the same curriculum due to various forms of discrimination.
Right. God, I could keep going.
Sorry, that was the very long.
No, because this would be a very long interview if I asked all the questions that I continue to have. But I will wrap it up to say, as we're making a new Civil War documentary that does focus on, not just the military history, but these social forces in and around the war. And so, out of a new documentary, what do you want to see?
Personally, I want to see, I'll just say that there is a lot of scholars that have, and I'm talking Norley Frankel, the late Megan McClintock, just to name a few, who have shown that there is a lot of importance in centering on family studies. Amy Morrell Taylor as well, right? Just to name a few. Chandra Manning, Tara Hunter, the list goes on of all these great scholars who have centered conversations around families, not just Black. And I think if that is a component of the documentary, I believe it'll be a way to be more illuminating and allow for conversations with Drew Gilpin Faust. Is it This Republic Suffering? I forget the exact title.
Yeah, I think that's
right. But I think of like how adding in the family and its consequences, right? Not just stopping in 1877. We've seen how battles over the Civil War rage today. But what does it say if we talk about the battles that families are experiencing during and long after, and especially including not just the North, the Midwest, Blacks and Afro-Canadians, Afro-Latin, if obviously a documentary can only do so much, and I recognize that, but I do think there's a great opportunity, and I'm so excited to see where it goes, and to just have any connection to it is a privilege. And I would just hope that, one, it's about a familial focus and not just an enslaved or the freed. Like, what does it mean to be a free-born Black person? Especially if we want to add in Afro-Canadians or other areas where they're coming in, because that's a whole nother layer of, well, you're coming in knowing the consequences. And I recognize that some of them were refugees, but still, like, they're coming back.
Yeah.
And because I tell my students, like, if we just took Harriet Tubman, right, for example, when she's like going in and she frees you and she says, all right, I'm going back, who's with me? I'll be honest, I don't know if I could go. I would be so scared, which says so much about how amazing she was, that she did it repeatedly. There's so much to be said about those who go back knowing what the experience was.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I wish I could hold up your book. I don't, and I gotta say, the cover of the book is wonderful.
Yeah, I'm very great. That was the press's decision. I am very grateful that it is focused on Black women, because that was, that when I saw that I got emotional because it's that they are the focus. And this totally spells book, like this is not just a Civil War history. This is a gendered history. This is a history of Black women, and how important they are to understanding the Civil War. So we need to put more respect on Black women's role in understanding the legacy of the war.
Again, thank you so much. Check out, remember, look out for his book, The Family Civil War, this summer, June, UGA Press, and keep joining us throughout the summer for more scholar interviews. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a great one.